There is a saying among old soldiers that the desert does not care who you are, only what you are willing to give it. Sergeant Elias Vane had given it almost everything already: his squad, his water, his faith that the war made any kind of sense. What he had left, he was about to give to a dying girl who was not even human, and that single act of stubborn decency was about to rewrite the rest of his life. The desert on Kestvar did not have a name that meant anything comforting. The scouts who mapped it called it the Ash Reach because from orbit it looked like a world-sized pile of cinders, gray and red and endless, baked under a sun that seemed personally offended by the presence of life. Elias had been walking it for 3 days. His transport had gone down hard, clipped by anti-air fire during a routine supply run that was supposed to be the least dangerous part of his rotation. Routine. He almost laughed every time he remembered the word. Routine had become a smoking crater and 4 dead friends, and a survival pack with 2 days of water stretched across what turned out to be 5 days of walking. He was down to a single canteen, maybe a third full. He had been rationing it in sips so small they barely qualified as drinking, just enough to keep his tongue from swelling shut, just enough to keep his mind from sliding into the kind of heat-drunk hallucinations that killed men faster than thirst itself. He had been a soldier for 11 years. Before that, a paramedic in a coastal city that didn't exist anymore, wiped off the map in the opening days of the war when humanity first found out it was not alone in the universe, and that not everyone out there was friendly. He carried both of those lives with him, the medic and the soldier, and some days he was not sure which one was in charge. Grief did that to a man. It reorganized him from the inside quietly until the person walking around wearing his face was running on something other than blood. He had lost his wife in that first bombing run. He had lost most of the version of himself that used to laugh easily. What remained was competent, careful, and very good at staying alive, which was its own kind of curse. Because staying alive, when you no longer entirely wanted to, had a way of feeling like a punishment instead of a victory. The military did not know what to make of him anymore. His file was full of commendations and also full of quiet notes from concerned officers about a man who volunteered for the worst postings and never seemed to fear death because some part of him was still waiting to catch up with it. Nobody expected much from Sergeant Vane, except competence and grim silence. That was the whole of his reputation. A reliable, joyless machine who did his job and asked for nothing. The desert had a way of stripping reputations down to the truth underneath them. On the 3rd day, cresting a dune that looked exactly like every other dune he had crossed, he saw the wreck. It was not human technology. The hull plates were a deep, bruised purple, curved in ways that suggested a species with a very different sense of aesthetics than mankind. And they caught the sunlight in a way that looked almost alive, shifting color as he moved around it. Some kind of small craft, a shuttle or a scout ship, torn open along one side like a piece of fruit peeled by a giant hand. It had clearly been down for a while. Sand had already begun drifting in through the breach. Elias's hand moved to his rifle out of habit rather than hope. 3 days without contact had trained him to expect nothing good. Then he heard it. A voice. Weak, rasping, unmistakably in pain, speaking words he did not understand in a language that sounded like wind chimes being dragged over gravel. He should have kept walking. Every survival protocol he had ever been taught told him to keep walking, to conserve his strength, to avoid unknown alien wreckage that could easily be a trap, a diseased corpse, an active minefield of unknown technology. He walked toward the voice instead. Inside the broken hull, tangled in the wreckage of what looked like a command chair, was a girl. That was the only word his mind supplied, even though he immediately understood she was not human and probably not a girl. In any sense his species would define, she looked young. Her skin held a faint opalescent sheen, pale violet shifting toward silver depending on the angle of the light, and her features were sharp and strange and beautiful in a way that made his tired brain ache trying to categorize them. Long limbs, too long for a human frame, folded awkwardly where they had been crushed against the console. Blood, dark blue-black, pooled beneath her, already drying at the edges in the merciless heat. Her eyes opened. When his shadow fell across her, they were gold, Not yellow, not amber. Gold like a coin freshly minted, and they fixed on him with the particular clarity of someone who knew exactly how close to death they were and had already made a kind of peace with it. She said something. A question, by the rising inflection. He didn't need the translation software in his helmet, long since dead from the crash that stranded him, to understand the meaning behind it. Are you here to finish the job? No, he said out loud, in his own language, kneeling slowly beside her with his hands visible and empty. I'm not here to hurt you. She did not understand the words. But something in his tone, in the careful way he moved, in the fact that a heavily armed soldier of an enemy species had knelt down instead of raising a weapon, seemed to register anyway. Her golden eyes tracked him with something between suspicion and desperate hope. He checked her injuries the way the paramedic buried inside him still knew how to do, even after all these years. Internal bleeding, almost certainly. A shattered leg, pinned under debris, and dehydration so severe her lips had cracked and her skin had gone dry and papery in a way that transcended species, because thirst was thirst, no matter what color your blood was. He had seen that particular kind of dying before. He knew exactly how many hours she had left without water. Not many. He unclipped his canteen. His hand actually shook doing it. Not from weakness, from the calculation running behind his eyes, cold and clear. Despite the heat delirium creeping at its edges, he had perhaps a third of a canteen left. Maybe 6 hours of margin between himself and death, assuming he found no further water sources, which in this dead gray waste was the safest possible assumption. Give her half of that, and his own margin collapsed to almost nothing. Give her all of it, and he was gambling his own life on a stranger from another species whose name he did not know, in a war that had killed his wife and half a dozen friends and turned entire continents to glass. He thought about that war for exactly 1 second. Then he thought about the fact that she was, underneath the purple skin and the golden eyes and the 2 long limbs, a person dying of thirst in front of him. And he was a person who happened to have water. He had been a paramedic before he was a soldier. Some things did not wash out of a man, no matter how much grief tried to scour them away. He unscrewed the cap and lifted her head gently, cradling it against his forearm, and brought the canteen to her cracked lips. She flinched at first, expecting poison or trick or violence, some final cruelty from an enemy soldier. Then the water touched her tongue, and whatever animal part of her brain still ran, the show overrode every ounce of suspicion, and she drank. He gave her most of it, not all. His training would not let him give all of it, some quiet mathematical part of his mind insisting on keeping a mouthful for himself, a last thread of margin. But he gave her almost everything he had left in the world to survive on. To a stranger, an alien, technically an enemy, because she was dying and he had the ability to stop it, and some decisions were simpler than the war made them look. She stared up at him after, gasping, some strength returning to her eyes. And she said something else. Softer, this time. Almost gentle. He didn't understand the words. He understood the tone. It was the sound of someone memorizing a face. He splinted her leg as best he could, with wreckage fragments and strips torn from his own uniform, moved her into what shade the broken hole provided, and stayed with her through the worst heat of the day, giving her sips from the last of his water whenever her breathing turned ragged. Saying nothing, because there was nothing to say that either of them could understand, just staying, which turned out to be its own kind of language. She lived through that day. By evening, her breathing had steadied. By the time the twin moons of Kestvar rose over the ash-colored dunes, she was conscious enough to grip his hand, weakly, and hold on. He had no water left at all by then. He did not tell her that. He simply sat beside her in the cooling dark rifle across his knees, watching the horizon for threats, and let himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, feel something other than the flat, gray exhaustion of grief. It felt something like purpose. It felt something like being useful for a reason that had nothing to do with killing. He did not know, sitting there in the freezing desert night with an alien stranger's hand wrapped around his own, that the girl he had just saved was Kailas Thorn Ve Aurelian, third heir to the Aurelian Dominion, one of the oldest and most powerful star nations in the quadrant. Chapter: A civilization with fleets that could scour a planet to bedrock in an afternoon if sufficiently provoked. He did not know that her personal guard had been hunting for her wreckage for 3 days with growing desperation, expecting at best to recover a body. He only knew that a dying stranger had gripped his hand in the dark and he had not let go. Dawn on the 4th day brought the ships. He heard them before he saw them, a deep bone-filled hum that vibrated up through the sand itself, and his first assumption, trained into him by years of war, was that death had finally arrived to collect what the desert had failed to take. He stood, putting his body between the wreckage and the sky, rifle raised, despite knowing with total clarity that a rifle would do exactly nothing against whatever was about to descend on them. 6 ships broke the pale morning sky, sleek, silver-purple, the same strange living color as the wreck beside him, moving with a silence that should have been impossible for something so large. They did not fire. They did not scatter troops. They simply landed in a wide circle around the wreckage, displacing sand in slow, rolling waves. And from the largest of them descended a procession that made Elias's exhausted mind struggle to process what he was looking at. Warriors in dark ceremonial armor, weapons drawn but not raised. Behind them, moving with a controlled urgency that barely masked raw terror, came an older figure, tall, silver-haired, wearing robes so heavily embroidered they seemed to shift color with each step, gold eyes identical to the girl's fixed on the wreckage with an intensity that could have burned through steel. Elias understood, in that moment, exactly who this was. He lowered his rifle. He did not run. Running would have accomplished nothing, and some tired, grief-worn part of him had simply run out of the capacity to be afraid of dying anymore. He had made his peace with that particular outcome a long time ago. Somewhere in the wreckage of his old life, he stepped aside from the girl, instead, hands open, and said, in a voice hoarse from thirst, "She's alive." The words meant nothing to them, linguistically. But the older man's eyes had already found his daughter, breathing, conscious, weakly raising one hand toward him, and whatever universal language existed between a parent and a child took over from there. The next several minutes were chaos of a controlled kind. Medical personnel in strange armored suits swarmed the wreckage, lifting the girl with a gentleness that seemed almost incongruous with their imposing size, running instruments over her that hummed and glowed and clearly reported back information that made every one of them visibly relax by degrees. Elias stood back and watched, swaying slightly, his body finally beginning to register just how close to its own limits it had pushed itself. 3 days without proper water, the last of it given away in the desert to a stranger. His vision had started to gray at the edges, sound going distant and underwater. He was aware, distantly, of the older man turning toward him, of golden eyes the same shape and color as the girl's, studying him with an expression he was too exhausted to read. He was aware of the girl, from her stretcher, saying something urgent, repeating a phrase, gesturing weakly toward him. He was aware of falling. He did not hit the ground. Someone, or something, caught him before the sand did, and the last thing he registered before the world went dark was the strange, not unpleasant scent of ozone and something like crushed flowers, and a voice, deep and accented and entirely unfamiliar, saying words he could not understand in a tone that sounded unmistakably like gratitude. He woke up in a bed that did not feel like any bed he had ever slept in. Too soft in some places, firm in exactly the right places elsewhere, as though it were adjusting itself in real time to the specific geography of his exhausted body. The room around him was pale gold, lit by no visible source, the air carrying that same faint floral ozone scent from before. For one disoriented moment he assumed he had died, and some part of him, tired as it was, felt almost disappointed to discover otherwise. A moment later, when a very human sensation of intravenous fluid dragged him fully back to consciousness, a voice spoke from beside the bed, translated this time through some small device resting on the nightstand, smooth and only slightly artificial. "You are awake." He turned his head. The old man from the desert sat in a chair beside him, robes exchanged for simpler dark clothing, but the intensity in his golden eyes unchanged. "Where am I?" Elias said. His voice came out cracked and rough. "Aboard the Aurelian flagship Sundering Light," the man said. "You have been unconscious for 1 full day. Your body was severely dehydrated. Our physicians tell me you would have died within perhaps 6 hours had we not found you when we did." Elias absorbed that slowly. "Your daughter, Kalis," the man said, and something in his composed voice cracked slightly on the name. "She is recovering. Her injuries were severe. Without the water you gave her, without the shelter you provided, she would have died in that wreckage long before we located it. How did you find us?" "Her beacon," the man said. "It was transmitting for 3 days. We were still 40 hours from arrival when you found her. You understand what that means." Elias did understand. Distantly, through the fog still clinging to his thoughts. It meant she had been alone and dying for a full day before he found her, and would have been alone and dying for at least another day and a half beyond that, had he not stopped. "I'm Sergeant Elias Vane," he said, because it seemed important suddenly that this stranger know his name rather than simply refer to him as the human who happened to be nearby. "I know who you are," the man said. "I am Torvash Aurelian. I am the first voice of the Aurelian Dominion." He paused, watching Elias's face carefully, as though gauging whether the words meant anything to him. They did not fully. Hop. Elias had a soldier's working knowledge of major alien powers, mostly framed in terms of which ones were shooting at humanity and which ones were not. The Aurelian Dominion had never fired a shot at Earth. They had also never particularly helped, remaining coldly neutral through years of war, a fact that had made them, in the minds of most human strategists, largely irrelevant. It was beginning to suspect that assessment had been catastrophically incomplete. "You are the ruler of your people," Elias said slowly. "I am the ruler of 11-star systems and roughly 400 billion souls," Torvash said, without any particular emphasis, as though reciting a shipping manifest. "Kalis is my only surviving child. Her mother died in a coup attempt 8 years ago, an attempt Kalis herself narrowly survived as a small girl, hidden in a wall for 11 hours while soldiers searched the palace for her. She has been the sole heir to the Dominion since that day. She was traveling incognito against significant council objection because she wished for one journey to see the stars without a fleet trailing behind her like a shadow." He paused. "Her ship was struck by debris from an unrelated conflict. In that system, not an attack, an accident, the kind of thing that happens in a war zone, regardless of anyone's intentions." Elias thought of his own transport clipped by anti-air fire on a routine run. The universe, it seemed, did not discriminate in its cruelty between species. "She would have died alone in the desert of my people's oldest enemy, if such a thing exists for us anymore, and instead she was found by a soldier of a species we have never even formally met, who gave her the last of his water and stayed with her through the night, expecting nothing." Torvash's voice, carefully composed until this point, finally wavered. "You understand what you have done, Sergeant Vane?" "I gave a dying kid some water," Elias said. "Anybody would have." Something flickered across Torvash's face, an expression Elias could not immediately place. "No," Torvash said quietly, "they would not have. We have encountered 11 other spacefaring species in our recorded history. We have offered aid to several of them, in moments of crisis, and watched most of them calculate the political value of accepting or refusing that aid before responding. We have watched allies abandon the wounded when the tactical situation shifted. We have watched entire fleets withdraw from rescue operations when the cost-benefit analysis turned unfavorable." He leaned forward. "You had perhaps 6 hours of water left in your own body. Sergeant Vane, my physicians were very precise about this. You gave away the majority of it to a stranger, from a species you had never encountered, wearing the uniform of a species engaged in an ongoing war with absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose. There was no calculation in it. There was no politics in it. There was a dying person, and you had water, and you gave it to her." His golden eyes, so like his daughter's, held Elias's gaze with an intensity that made the exhausted soldier want to look away and could not quite manage it. "In 11-star systems and 400 billion souls, Sergeant Vane, I have very rarely encountered anything so simple and so profound as what you did in that desert. Elias did not know what to say to that. He had not done it to be profound. He had done it because a person was dying in front of him and he had the means to stop it, and some part of him, worn thin by years of war and grief, had needed, badly, to save someone instead of failing to save them for once. He said as much quietly, and Torvash listened to every word, with an expression that suggested he understood exactly what Elias meant. Perhaps more than Elias himself did. "May I ask you something personal, Sergeant Vane?" Elias nodded. "Our physicians reviewed your medical history when they treated you. As a matter of necessity, I am aware of the loss of your partner in the early bombardment of your homeworld. I am aware of the losses in your unit 3 days before we found you. I understand that you have, by the assessment of your own military psychologists, been existing in a state of prolonged grief that borders on active despair." Elias felt his jaw tighten. "That's classified information. It was necessary for your treatment," Torvash said, not unkindly. "I mention it only because I want you to understand why what you did affected me as deeply as it has." A man broken by grief, with every reason in the universe to have hardened himself against feeling anything for anyone, found a stranger dying in the sand, and chose kindness anyway, at cost to himself, expecting nothing in return. He shook his head slowly. "That is not a small thing, Sergeant Vane. That may be the largest thing I have witnessed in decades of rule." Elias looked away toward the pale golden light of the ceiling, uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with his physical recovery. "She's really your daughter," he said finally to change the subject, "the princess." "She is." "Can I see her?" Torvash's expression shifted into something gentler. "She has been asking for you since she regained consciousness. I was under strict instruction to bring you to her the moment you woke, and I have already delayed that instruction by several minutes, indulging my own need to speak with you. First, forgive an old father his priorities." He rose and gestured for Elias to follow. Elias Thorne Vane Aurelian sat propped upright in a medical bed in a chamber down the corridor, her leg encased in some manner of shimmering regenerative brace. Color returned to her opalescent skin, golden eyes bright and alert in a way they had not been in the desert. She looked, Elias thought, remarkably like her father. Same intensity behind the eyes, same stubborn set to the jaw. She saw him in the doorway, and her entire face changed. Some careful royal composure cracking into something younger and rawer and profoundly relieved. She spoke rapidly, and the translation device at her bedside struggled to keep pace, rendering her words half a beat behind her expression. "You stayed," was what it eventually produced. "I remember. I was so afraid, and you stayed." "Somebody had to," Elias said. "Seemed rude to leave halfway through." The translation device rendered this slightly strangely, and Elias's confused pause was followed a moment later by a surprised, delighted laugh, the first sound of genuine humor Elias had heard since this entire impossible situation began. "You are very strange for a soldier of an enemy species," she said, once the device caught up properly. "We're not enemies," Elias said. "Your people never fought mine. As far as I know, this is the first conversation a human and an Aurelian have ever had." Elias exchanged a look with her father, something passing between them that Elias could not fully read. "That is true," Torvash said slowly. "The Dominion has maintained strict neutrality throughout your species war. We considered it wisdom. At the time, distance from a conflict not our own. And now?" Elias asked, before he could stop himself. Torvash was quiet for a long moment. "Now," he said, "I find myself reconsidering a great many assumptions about your species, based entirely on the actions of one exhausted, grieving soldier who gave away his water in a desert." Elias did not know it yet. Standing in that pale golden medical chamber with an alien princess smiling at him and her father watching him with an expression of dawning world-altering intent. But that reconsideration was about to reshape the balance of an entire interstellar war. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, dreamlike momentum that Elias found himself swept along by, rather than steering. He was, technically still a soldier of the human military, currently listed as missing in action, presumed dead, somewhere in a filing system light years away. The Aurelian Dominion resolved that particular bureaucratic problem with the same quiet, overwhelming competence they seemed to apply to everything, dispatching a formal diplomatic communication to human command that could most charitably be summarized as "We have your soldier, he is alive, and we would very much like to discuss the future of relations between our peoples because of what he did." Human command, predictably, panicked, then scrambled, then sent representatives at a speed that suggested years of careful diplomatic planning rather than the frantic days it actually took. Elias sat in on some of those early meetings, still recovering, still faintly disoriented by the scale of what his small act of kindness had apparently set into motion. He watched human diplomats, men and women far above his pay grade, struggle to process the fact that the Aurelian Dominion, a power that could have ended the war against humanity's other enemies with a single fleet deployment, was suddenly, urgently interested in formal alliance, and that the entire shift in policy traced back to one exhausted sergeant sharing his canteen with a dying stranger in the desert. "You understand the position this puts us in," the lead human diplomat said to him privately on the third day, in a tone that mixed exasperation with something like awe. "The Dominion has ignored every formal request for alliance we've sent in 6 years of war. 6 years, Sergeant, and then you hand a canteen to their princess, and within a week they're drafting a mutual defense treaty." "I didn't hand her a canteen to start a treaty," Elias said. "I gave her water because she was dying." "I know," the diplomat said. "That's exactly why it worked. If you'd done it calculating an angle, they'd have seen through it in a heartbeat. Their intelligence assessment of you was thorough, Sergeant. They know you weren't performing kindness for an audience. There was no audience. That's what makes it worth an alliance to them." Elias found that logic simultaneously reasonable and deeply strange to sit inside of. He had not saved a life to earn a treaty. He had saved a life because a life was in front of him and worth saving. That the universe had decided to reward that instinct with geopolitical consequences on a staggering scale felt like an accident of scale rather than a plan. Kalis, recovering well enough by the second week to move under her own power with the aid of a cane, sought him out often during that strange transitional period, and their conversations, slowly, began to require less and less assistance from the translation device as she picked up fragments of his language with startling speed, driven by what she freely admitted was simple, stubborn curiosity about the man who had refused to let her die alone. "You could ask for anything," she told him once, sitting across from him in the observation deck of the flagship, watching a nebula bleed color across the void outside the viewport. "My father has said, as much publicly, wealth, title, a place in the Dominion Court, should you wish it. You save the last heir to an 11-system nation. There is very little you could ask for that would be refused." "I don't want anything," Elias said, and meant it. "That is precisely why he intends to give you everything anyway," Kalis said, with the dry humor he had come to recognize as very much her own, inherited perhaps from watching her father navigate decades of court politics. "You have made yourself impossible to properly repay, Sergeant Vane. That is a very inconvenient thing to do, to a man raised to believe every debt must eventually be settled." He laughed at that, quietly, an act that still felt slightly unfamiliar after so many years of grief. It surprised him each time it happened, the way old muscles remembered old motions. "What do you actually want?" Kalis asked, more seriously after a moment. "Not what you think you should want. What do you want, Elias Vane?" He considered the question longer than was probably polite. "I want the war to end," he said finally. "I want it to end in a way that doesn't require anyone else to lose what I lost. That's it. That's the whole list." Kalis studied him for a long moment. Gold eyes, unreadable in the dim light of the observation deck. "Then perhaps," she said quietly, "you have already gotten what you asked for, without realizing it. My father does not commit the Dominion lightly, Sergeant Vane. He has spent 6 years refusing to be drawn into your war, believing it not the Dominion's fight. He is now drafting terms for direct military support, full alliance, a fleet commitment that will very likely end your conflict within the year, because of you. Because you gave a stranger water in a desert and expected nothing back. Elias sat, with that in silence for a long while, watching the nebula bleed its slow colors across the dark, feeling something shift inside his chest that had been frozen still since the day his wife died in a bombing run that took half a coastal city with her. It felt unmistakably like the return of something he had thought permanently lost hope. The formal alliance was signed 6 weeks later, in a ceremony that Elias attended reluctantly, standing at the edge of a hall filled with dignitaries from both species, feeling profoundly out of place among the polished uniforms and formal robes. Torvash Aurelian, first voice of the Dominion, found him there, at the edge of the gathering during a lull in the ceremony, and stood beside him quietly for a moment, before speaking. "You changed the course of a war, Sergeant Vane," Torvash said. "I want you to understand that clearly, not as flattery, but as fact. Our fleets will turn the tide of your conflict within months. Worlds that would have burned will not burn now. Soldiers who would have died will live, because of a canteen of water and a night spent beside a stranger in the sand." "I didn't do it for any of that," Elias said again, because it still felt important to keep saying, to keep the record straight, even as the scale of the consequences grew larger than he could properly hold in his mind. "I know," Torvash said. "That is the entire point, Sergeant Vane. That is why it mattered as much as it did." He paused, watching the ceremony unfold across the hall, his daughter standing tall and recovered among the dignitaries, catching Elias's eye across the distance and offering him a small private smile that had nothing formal about it at all. "My daughter has asked that you be given a permanent place within the Dominion's diplomatic mission to your people," Torvash said. "Not as a reward, as a request. She says she trusts very few people in this universe with the things that matter most. She says you are one of them." Elias looked across the hall at Kalis, gold eyes bright and alive, in a way they had not been when he found her broken and dying in the wreckage of her ship, and felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into something that finally made a kind of sense. He had walked into that desert a grieving man who had stopped expecting anything good from the universe. He was walking out of it into a life he could never have imagined, built on the foundation of a single choice, made without calculation, without hope of reward, simply because a person was dying and he happened to have water. The war ended, 8 months later, faster and with fewer losses than any human strategist had dared predict, the weight of the Aurelian Dominion's fleets breaking the back of an enemy that had never expected such an ally to emerge from what should have been an unrelated desert tragedy on a forgotten world. Elias stood at the formal peace signing, beside Kalis and her father, no longer a lost sergeant presumed dead in a filing system, but a name known across a dozen star systems, the man who gave his water to a dying princess and never once asked what it might be worth. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself still as a tired man who had once been a paramedic, who had once had a wife, who had once believed the universe owed him nothing, and delivered on that belief thoroughly. But somewhere in a gray desert, on a forgotten world, kneeling beside a dying stranger with an empty canteen in his hands, he had rediscovered something he thought the war had burned out of him completely. The simple, uncalculated instinct to help another living thing, expecting nothing back. It had cost him almost nothing to do, in that single moment. It had given him in return an entire new life, a war ended sooner than it should have been possible to end, and a family, strange and golden-eyed and utterly unexpected, who would never forget the man who knelt in the sand and chose kindness when kindness cost him everything he had left. That, in the end, was the whole of the story, and perhaps the only lesson worth taking from it. Kindness given without calculation has a way of returning tenfold, in forms no one could have predicted, to people who never asked for anything but the chance to matter to someone again. If this story moved you, stick around because there are more tales like this one waiting. Stories of quiet people doing quiet, decent things in the middle of chaos and watching that decency change the shape of the world around them. Let me know in the comments what part of Elias and Kalis' story hit you hardest. Give this video a like if you believe kindness is still the most powerful force in any universe. Share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more stories just like this one. Until next time, Keep your eyes on the stars and keep a little water in your canteen for the next stranger who needs it.